James Melendez, thank you for joining me today. Today's subject matter is ESG, environment, social, and governance, looking through the lens via citizen, consumer, employee, and investor. Stay tuned. So I met one ESG financial analyst at a fund, and this individual complained quite often. They're an acquaintance, they're not a friend. And when I met this person, they talked and complained, and I think it was a worry about ESG and how this particular geography, it's not anywhere in the United States, and this particular geography is very sensitive in terms of it doesn't have a great track record for environment, social, and governance practices. This person was very concerned. I would say not just concerned, but stressed out about this. I did ask the person why they're doing this job if they have these concerns. Basically, this individual could go to a different organization to do similar work and not be in the ESG field, and in particular in this geography as well. Now, that did raise my alarm and concern about ESG. I think it talked about how organizations can adopt practices to do better things. We participate in each and every one of these: citizen, consumer, employee, and investor. In one organization where I was an employee, and I looked at their ESG, I was actually all these four things: a citizen, consumer, employee, and investor. And I felt ultimately that the organization wasn't holding up to those values. They thought they were doing a great job. I really looked at governance and social, and I thought the mark was missed quite a bit. So a lot of organizations will give themselves a pat on the back where perhaps they don't deserve one. Or perhaps I think it's more authentic that an organization can identify particular areas of growth and opportunity, right? And I think that's something that this organization didn't do. So this organization does not have diversity for their employment base. It is actually very, very indistinct. It actually is an industry that does not recognize diversity as an important factor, yet it reports on this, and it tends to show that it's doing an amazing job, which in fact it was not. You can look at historical perspectives that probably actually predate this and go to religio-spiritual systems that do address this. Now, I'm going to start off here with the founder of the Methodist Church, John Wesley. He has a famous sermon called The Use of Money. He talks specifically on many, it's actually a very broad sermon, and he talks about not harming via business practices. Now, he does say things like earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. Avoid businesses that profit from gambling, alcohol, weapons, and tobacco. Now, the perspective on pension funds in the 1950s by labor unions is to look at targeted funds, targeted investments to invest in organizations that they believe do things that are aligned with their membership and their purpose of a union. Now, in the 1960s, we have the Civil Rights Movement. So people protested against ethical standards of corporate behavior. And so it could involve not just the Vietnam War, but other things that were questionable as well. Now, in 1985 to 93, Columbia University students protest against South Africa's apartheid laws. It's a sense of momentum when you see that Columbia University students had an ability to make a change and make a difference. Environmental responsibility is, you have vast funds from the Norwegian government based on oil, and then CalPERS, and over 15 years they pledged sustainability, environmental sustainability. So you see a little bit of ESG being laid out here. In 2004, financial institutions are invited by the UN, and this is the first time the term ESG is mentioned. What is ESG? It is this triad here: environment, social, and governance. We all want to work for companies that do the right thing. The environment is to look at these, including additional items. So it's not just about energy efficiency, reducing carbon impact, and so forth. It's this plus much more. Social, this is a part of DIB, which is diversity, inclusion, and belonging. It's about impact of the community, supply chain transparency. So this social bucket is very large. So when I look at social, based on, this is the one that touches us probably most often. There are things here that I want to make sure that they're doing. And this is one where we might notice that, for example, maybe the DIB, the diversity, inclusion, and belonging, is not that robust. I noted that an organization I work for really wasn't committed to their diversity and inclusion. And I think that was a really terrible thing because their ratings never really reflected that. That is, perhaps maybe Glassdoor might show what people really thought. Or perhaps the organization's DIB was such a small part of social that it didn't really decrease their rating as a downgrade. And so you can see here the build to what is a downgrade or an upgrade. And lastly, governance. Not my favorite term here. I would actually use a different term. I might use the word corporate impact, org impact, But I think this is one where he talked about, of course, board diversity, financial practices, compliance, and so forth. I would love to see the name change here. I don't think it really is applicable, is that organizations really aren't downgraded or upgraded appropriately. And perhaps one very specific important issue to you may not be addressed in that ESG rating. In fact, they could be upgraded even when an organization has done absolutely nothing. So that's the focus of, say, your investment, and maybe even looking at the organization you work at or a community member. There's many ways that we participate in this, whether we want to or not. So this looks similar to a rating, a credit rating, a bond rating. And so you see these triple C to triple A. Now let's look more specifically about ESG rating agencies. MSCI publishes ratings on 8,500 companies, so their reach is very large. Their analysis in terms of what they view as a particular rating is pretty profound. There are billions and trillions of dollars that are invested specifically because of ESG ratings. Now, is the industry regulated? Not really. As of the year 2022, the EU has new reporting regulations that encompass some U.S. companies, if not many, if not most. Now, I think that's very important because it's asking a question: who rates the rating agencies and how do they rate? What is the transparent scope? I'll talk more about that in a moment. This is a very eye-opening video to watch. ESG rating systems are not what they seem. And so some call outs here that I took away from this video. So as an investor or employee or community member, you might want to look at this in terms of how important this is and the impact of this. So I won't read each of these bullet points, but there is no uniform definition of ESG. So that's in line with a very fundamental problem, a foundational problem of what ESG is or is not, is it can be defined many different ways. And what I found fascinating here was they reported, for example, that McDonald's in the UK and France were actually upgraded because their actions, say on the E part, the environmental part, was that it was seen that they were doing something that increased their particular rating. But the reality was what was not being included was their carbon footprint for their main product, beef. Beef production was not included. It wasn't encompassing one of the biggest uses of carbon. So it becomes a basis and decision for investors and institutional investors. And how do they invest? Ratings are subjective and it's completely unregulated, again, as I mentioned. And so when ratings are subjective, because there's no transparency, how are they made? What decisions are actually more important than other decisions? Is, say, the social aspect less important than environment? And vice versa. So we can look at this and say, how do these actually come together and how do they actually work? Now, there are certain things that I just pulled out. You can do this search yourself. You can find that there's a lot of skepticism in terms of what ESG looks like, what it is in terms of, these reportings. So Columbia University, Harvard Business Review, New York Times, Forbes, and so forth. One of these that stood out to me was Real Clear Markets. Given how 401k plans have reacted to stressors in the market, one cannot put too much faith in ESG funds because they perform exceptionally poorly compared to non-ESG index funds. You're not necessarily getting an incremental improvement in what you want in your investment portfolio. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and these are just some things that are unknown, there's no transparency on how ESG ratings are calculated, no standards on rankings and how they are derived. As an organization, as a corporation, are you just shopping for the best review possible? If you have 140 to 160 choices from an agency, you could definitely pick and pull that particular one that's going to give you the highest ratings or highest group of ratings. And it's very interesting when we look at, say, Sarbanes-Oxley. If you looked back at, say, online searches when that was being instituted, corporations complained about how difficult it was going to be to comply with SOX. And when you look at this, organizations in general do not complain about ESG, even though it may take a lot of reporting and a lot of additional lift from that organization, that is people doing this work to meet these goals and to meet their particular rating agencies' request for information. So this is a lot of things that go into an ESG rating and things that, questions that we should ask ourselves, not just as an individual investor, as an employee, but we should ask about this as a community member and about the industry as a whole. Now, we all interact, again, as I mentioned, as a consumer, employee, investor, and citizen, sometimes uniquely in all four of these with one organization. I look at all these organizations. Does that airline Does that food producer, does that retailer, do these organizations really comply and have high standards of ESG behavior? So I definitely look at that and say, I'm very concerned in many ways that that is actually not really helping in changing the world the way the United Nations had assembled this meeting originally. And perhaps that needs to be reinvigorated, and perhaps with EU regulation that might change some of this. So see the Bloomberg video, you'll see that McDonald's did nothing except what was required of them or what was in the works anyway. It was not something that they did uniquely to increase their environment score, but it just happened automatically. And so that was something that's, eye-catchy for me. I think about organizations in terms of their environmental impact. Are they doing enough? And so many times I probably would say, no, they're not. I don't see that happening. I don't see tangible evidence. So why are we not feeling any of the positive effects of ESG? Are companies hiring people on a more diverse basis? Not really. We can look at that and say organizations definitely complain, especially corporations, that they can't find the right people with the right experience. But when it comes to layoff time, often they're going to lay off people that are the first to lay off are, say, women and people of color, people of a diverse background. Does their social index go down for the ESG rating? Probably not. And so these are the things that are disconcerting. There is no particular singular definition of ESG. What does it really mean? And so when an organization is doing everything that is ESG, are they actually doing anything? The answer seems to be today that they're not. They're not doing anything any different. They may be reporting on something, but as reports go, you can actually create a report and talk about things and spin it in your direction that is positive to the organization, but it's actually not doing anything. If something is too good to be true, it probably is. So this is a perspective that when you walk away from this, definitely look at the Bloomberg video. I think it's one to think about this topical matter and how we look at this and how we can think of ourselves as being participants, as a citizen, as a consumer, employee, and an investor, and that we need to ask more questions and that we need to hold accountability for everyday parts of our lives because we interact with thousands of brands or organizations or companies. Maybe there are things that are important to us that we would like to see registered and like to hold accountability for those organizations that are really not doing a good job of ESG, even though their ESG rating, quote unquote, is high. I appreciate you watching. Be sure to share this video, subscribe to this channel, and please give a like. I do appreciate it, and I will see you very soon.